Återhållsamhet är ju en dygd, men vi har 2 världsstjärnor här på scenen ikväll. Naomi Klein är, som ni alla vet, en av den globala klimatrörelsens absolut främsta debattörer och författare. Johan Rockström är en av världens ledande klimatforskare, så det känns fantastiskt kul att ha dem på scen tillsammans. Faktiskt för första gången någonsin. Så jag ska bara säga någonting kort här om platsen vi befinner oss på också, för den har ett visst symbolvärde här ikväll tycker jag. Jag vet inte hur många av er som känner till detta, men när riksdagen byggdes om på 70- och 80-talet så var faktiskt det här rummet som vi är i nu, stora scenen, också plenisalen för riksdagen. Eller då var det plenisalen, det var inte en teater då. Det har liksom hänt en hel del sedan dess. Det fanns inte ett miljödepartement i Sverige på den tiden. Nu har vi som bekant en miljöparti i regeringen, så att utvecklingen går uppenbarligen framåt på något sätt. Men jag tror också i det här så finns det också någon form av insikt som börjar landa på ganska många plan i samhället. Att trots alla kriser i världen så på lång sikt så är klimatfrågan mänsklighetens absolut största fråga. Självklart är det också någonting som borde influera politiska beslut på alla plan. Och hur ska vi komma dit? Förhoppningsvis så kommer vi ha lite fler svar på den frågan efter kvällens samtal. Miljöminister Åsa Romson reser snart ner till Paris för att förhandla vid FN:s klimatförhandlingar. Jag hoppas att hon har läst Naomi Kleins bok redan. Om inte annat så hoppas att hon kommer göra det innan hon åker. Jag hoppas också att hon tar med sig Johan Rockströms ord ner på resan. Han har sagt så här: vi är den första generation som förstått hur vi påverkar planeten i grunden. Och vi antar den sista generation som kan göra någonting åt det. Det är viktiga ord att komma ihåg. Med det så byter jag språk till engelska. Och without further ado, and for the first time on stage together, let me introduce 2 of the world's leading thinkers on climate change. Professor Johan Rockström, writer and activist Naomi Klein. Give them a big hand.
Well, so starting in Swedish, god kväll på er, underbart att se er. This is Swedish, wonderful to see you, basically. Let me start in the obvious end. As a scientist, I must admit very clearly, I'm one of your big fans. I've been a big fan of your work, Naomi, since LOGO, the shock doctrine, and I've been reading This Changes Everything with an enormous amount of respect, and the research that you put in this book is tremendous. And let me start just by saying, right at the front, this is a book that aligns itself perfectly with the science. And I think that is a very important starting point. It's a basis. But then we have a few differences along the way, and we'll touch upon them. And the idea of this conversation, Naomi, is that we'll start, so to say, giving you space to describe certain parts of the book, and I'll introduce them to you. And then by the end, we'll have a bit of a chat around some of the differences that we might have on the approach towards achieving a decarbonized, safe future for humanity. And then we'll open the floor at the end, roughly at 10 to 7. But before we start with anything, I really want, and we described this together, you said yourself, just a few days back, Paris meant this climate summit. Today, Paris means disaster. It means threat to humanity. It means eroding of trust. It means a disaster for humans in Paris and also for the trust-based and democratic societies. And please, just your testimony of how you see the terrorism in Paris linked to the global future for humanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's wonderful to be here. It's an honor to share the stage with you. I always get nervous appearing with climate scientists, especially world-famous ones. Like, I think I'm going to make a mistake. So it means a lot to me to hear that the book aligns with the science, because I'm going to share that with my amazing research assistant as soon as I get off stage, because we want to have this debate, but we don't want to have the debate about the footnotes. We want to be actually conservative about the facts, because the facts are alarming enough that you don't need to exaggerate, right? And I actually just got off the phone with the board and staff of 350.org, around the world, talking about the Paris attacks, how everybody's doing, especially those who are based in Paris. And obviously on a human level, it's terrifying, and completely destabilizing and horrific, particularly that so many young people lost their lives. We haven't recovered yet. The ground is moving beneath our feet. This is a familiar feeling. I remember I've been to Stockholm only a couple of times. It's been 8 years since I was here last. And the time before that was, about 8 years earlier, and it was right after September 11th. And I remember being here as we were trying to figure out what this new world meant. And what often happens when we face a huge shock is that we lose our confidence in what we know, in the stories that help us to understand the world. And that's when these moments of shock become particularly dangerous, because there are always people who are willing to move into that gap between event and meaning, event and narrative, and say, this is what this means. It means they hate our freedom. It means we must be merciless with the barbarians. It means endless war. I feel like we have learned collectively something from the ways in which previous shocks have been exploited to change the subject from conversations we really need to have, right? We know that climate change is linked to the war in Syria and all of the reverberations around the world, including the Paris attacks. This is not a controversial statement. John Kerry, 2 weeks ago, said it. He said that this historic drought in Syria was one of the main factors that led to the acceleration of conflict. Crop failure, people move, tensions increase. And then if you think also, it's not the only factor, right? Obviously, the actions of dictators, the rise of a particular kind of religious extremism, but also, let's face it, the fateful decision to illegally invade Iraq more than a decade ago destabilized the entire region. And that is also linked to climate change, because that had more than a little to do with the West's thirst for fossil fuels, for oil. So, we have these two impacts converging. On the one hand, the conflict to search out more and more of the substance that we need to get off, and on the other hand, the impacts of burning all that fossil fuels playing out in extreme weather and drought. So, Paris has everything. The climate summit in Paris should not be blown off the political map because of war, because of conflict. In fact, we need to double down on real climate solutions and say, in fact, we should think of the Paris summit as a peace summit. A climate summit is a peace summit. Getting to 100% renewables is our fastest route to global stability and peace. And we can't be afraid to have confidence in what we know in these moments of shock and terror.
Mm. Thank you. And this is, yes, exactly. This is not only in my mind, entirely correct. It's such an important statement that we must go to Paris. We must talk about a rapid transformation to a safe climate future as a venture of peace. And as you exactly point out, science is increasingly very clear on the fact that we see for the first time in human history on this planet that social and ecological change is occurring abruptly at the regional to planetary scale, hitting back on societies, on communities, causing turbulence. Yeah. So you can no longer disconnect the kind of refugee crisis that we see in Europe, the kind of terrorism we see from planetary change. And I think that's a very important point. Thank you so much for that. Now, I'd like to go into your fantastic book. And by the way, congratulations on launching this in Swedish. That's a remarkable achievement. Now,
it is. I'm not blasé.
Now, I mean, we've all read it, of course, and I'd like to make just an introduction as a scientist to this, and just To begin with, to make clear, I mean, you make a statement in the book that this is a result of 5 years research, which has also been a 5 years struggle of understanding the transformation for the planet, but also your own personal struggle, and finally getting not only the book, but also successfully getting your child, and understand that your 3-year-old boy is actually here in Stockholm with you, and I mean, this is a fantastic achievement. And there are so many fantastic places in this book, but I'd like to start off this conversation with 2, in my mind, very fundamental conclusions. And the first one is on the mind shift that we as humanity must now endorse if we are to succeed in reconnecting our human future to our finite, limited, small, beautiful planet. And this is on one of the final chapters, and you write like this: on a much more optimistic note, and that's something important. I mean, you make the risk analysis so succinctly and so hard, but you're also taking a very strong stance on opportunities. I started to learn that protecting and valuing the Earth's ingenious systems of reproducing life and the fertility of all of its inhabitants may lie at the center of the shift in worldview that must take place if we are to move beyond extractivism, your important point. A worldview based on regeneration and renewal rather than domination and depletion. And I think that summarizes very nicely your mind shift towards a new future. And this is also then coupled to your very strong point about the challenge. And this challenge, I think, is very well pointed out in the book as well, where you write that the nature of the moment is familiar, but bears repeating. Whether or not industrialized countries begin deeply cutting our emissions this decade, meaning that we are in a transformative mode towards decarbonizing within the next decades, will determine whether we can expect the same from rapidly developing nations like China and India the next decade. So Sweden has a particular responsibility, as does Canada, as does the rich nations in the world. That in turn will determine whether or not humanity can stay within a collective carbon budget, you're absolutely correct there, that will give us a decent chance of keeping warming below levels that our own governments have agreed are unacceptably dangerous. And to me, these 2 together points at the very hard statement on where we need to achieve and what is the vision and the mind shift. And I'd like to ask you as a starting point, when you see then the last couple of years and the new wind that is blowing in the climate negotiations, are you in general kind of hoping for some major progress in Paris, or do you remain skeptical of what we can achieve at the climate summit?
I feel like the attitude towards the climate summit in Paris is healthier than it was in 2009 for Copenhagen, which was, that was the first climate summit that I ever went to, and the stance of the movement was. It was, to me, strangely passive, like just almost begging leaders. And the movement was almost a little bit childlike. Like we were, I remember, getting to Copenhagen and being surrounded by all these images of Obama with gray hair and Merkel, older, and what will you tell your grandkids? It was totally personalized on these leaders, and we were asking them to sort of be messianic figures for us, and lead us. And it was all this discourse of one summit to save the world, tick, 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 now or never. And I don't see that from the climate movement anymore. I think people are going, even before the attacks in Paris, which frankly, really do threaten to derail the focus of leaders that was better than it was. I think the signs were good going in. I think in general, at 350 we talk about the road through Paris, not the road to Paris. For a long time it was all like the road to Paris, as if everything ends in Paris. And there was this deliberate decision, I think, wisely to stop saying that. The world does not end in Paris; it continues. That said, I think that there were a lot of good signs leading to the summit. At the movement level, we were seeing, a wave of big victories, which were due to a combination of, really focused and courageous action, what in the book I call blockadia, and also the market effects of this very sudden drop in oil prices, right? So For instance, Shell announced in September that they would not be drilling in the Arctic for the foreseeable future. And I think that that was a combination of the price of oil dropping from $100 a barrel to below 50, and the profit margins shrinking, and the investors going, is this really a good idea? And on the other hand, hundreds of kayaktivists, as they called themselves, this is a new word, kayaktivists, surrounding Shell's rig when they made the mistake of parking, in two of the greenest cities in the United States, Seattle and Portland. That was quite funny to watch. So Shell makes that announcement, then Obama basically closes the door behind them and makes it much harder. He should never have let them in the first place, but that was something. The cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline just 2 weeks ago, which was huge for our movement in North America. The tar sands are contracting because of this combination of concerns about pipeline capacity and profitability. So Shell also just took a $2 billion write-down on a mine in the Alberta tar sands. Basically, they're cutting their losses because they're not sure they can get it out if they dig it up. So that's a success of the movement. And then you have, China coming to the table, as with, landmark commitments to cap emissions by 2030. And this is also the result of pressure from below. It is not just, Obama has a meeting and they, convinces China, which is the way this is sort of often reported. This is the fact that there is, a huge surge of mobilization in China over air pollution, and this is just rewriting the map. It's closing huge numbers of coal plants. So I would say that, I wouldn't use a word like optimistic, but that signs are pointing in the right direction. And then, to your question about that mind shift. I must say, and it's weird for me as a secular Jewish feminist, pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, pro all the things you can, assume, that I am also a big fan of the Pope, and I think this Pope is a bit of a game changer. And I believe that the encyclical is so significant in that it specifically challenges the logic of dominion, of domination, and says we are in community with all of nature. It says that nature has an inherent right, not just for us, but in and of itself. This is kind of revolutionary within one of the very most powerful religions in the world. So I see a lot of signs that something is changing.
I totally agree with you. And let me ask about the Pope. By the way, as you may be aware, we as scientists helped out during a long, long way behind the scenes with Cardinal Turkson in writing the content of that encyclical. So again, it's a piece of very transformative document that talks in line with science, about our responsibility, and about hope. Now, when that was launched in the US, even Fox News had tremendous time for the Pope on the news. And that must have meant something in terms of, you write in your book, and you refer to my dear friend Dan Kahan, who shows very clearly that conservative Republicans, largely often religious, right-wing thinkers in North America, they simply shut out everything that's called science because they have their predisposed view, which is basically just questioning all kinds of regulation, everything that has to do with a kind of big government on the environment. And in comes the Pope, that suddenly shoots kind of like a torpedo right through this viewpoint, because they are often religious believers. And he says, I'm the head of this church, and I tell you, we must now be responsible for this little planet because it's our future. Now, do you think this could shift your views in terms of how locked in the conservative thinking is in terms of being anti-climate action in North America?
So it's complicated because I think that you have a landscape in the United States where the media is so compartmentalized, and you have this huge segment of the population that gets all of their news and information from these very conservative news outlets like Fox. So I don't think that most Republicans deny climate change because they adhere to this very, very strong dominance-based worldview. I think they mostly deny because this is their news source, right? And I do think that the Pope he's doing an end run around all of that, right? And the fact that he's hugely popular and got this rock star treatment in the United States, you could already see the impact in polling after the Pope's visit to the United States in terms of belief in climate change. I mean, it wasn't dramatic, but it had an impact. But at the same time, the Koch brothers, they're spending $900 million in the next presidential election. $900 million. That's more than either the Democrats or the Republicans. These are just two rich brothers. And their money is made from fossil fuels. And they have a vested interest in spreading confusion and doubt about climate change. And so there was this hashtag about that a group of Catholic activists started called, Koch versus Pope, right? Where this is really the choice. It's about whether these politicians are going to side with the Pope or they're going to side with the Kochs, and so far they're siding with the Kochs, and that has impacts on the information that gets out there and so on. But I think that something like that it's difficult to measure. It's not something that's like the Pope says this and suddenly, everything changes. But I also think it has a huge impact in the developing world. When I was at the Vatican with the launch of the encyclical, I was there for a conference of activists talking about how to operationalize the encyclical. And the people who were most excited were Latin Americans, particularly in Brazil, who talked about how they're in conflict with left governments or center-left governments that are extremely extractivist, that are, allowing horrible things to happen in the Amazon with mega dams and deforestation. And basically they said, we've got the Pope on our side now, and that really helps. So it isn't just about the impact on the Republican Party, though I think that is a big impact. I think maybe this Pope's biggest impact will be, in countries like Brazil and the Philippines, in emboldening the grassroots, to take on very powerful forces.
Yeah, and what I'm saying now I don't have entire evidence for, but apart from having read a lot of the science, Pope Francis, he must have read this book. Because clearly the encyclical takes a very bold step, as you may be aware, that apart from making it very clear that the science shows that we're facing potentially catastrophic risks and that we now need to take a responsibility for creation, it also actually takes forward a remarkably harsh criticism on capitalism, on consumerism, on egoism, and on the kind of tendency towards kind of differentiation between the rich and the poor. And it basically aligns itself with your thinking, with Thomas Piketty. And I'm kind of opening the door here for you. What's your thinking when you look at the world when it comes to your point in the book that climate action is often perceived or has been perceived as socialism? My note there was, well, that's a typical North American perspective. Now you're in Europe. What's your thinking? You just come from Denmark. Do you think that applies worldwide today, or is it shifting? Or what would be your diagnostic on the conventional, old traditional thinking that environmental action is, so to say, perceived as socialism, while the rest is, so to say, conservative ideology?
So I think that a lot of these labels break down. Obviously, the reason why I called the book This Changes Everything is because the future is radical, right? So you can call yourself a conservative, but if you are standing in the way of climate action, as most political conservatives are doing right now, if they're associated with conservative political parties, you're a radical. You are advocating actively an extremely radical future in which our world has changed, right? Because we've made the problem so much worse, because we've procrastinated for 2.5 decades and allowed emissions to increase by 60%, if we are going to stay within that very limited carbon budget, we now need to take radical action. So I don't think conservatives have, I think basically everybody's being conservative in one way or another. And in order to be conservative, you kind of have to be radical. And the people who call themselves conservatives are actually the biggest radicals around because they're advocating massive sea level rise and crop failure, and that's insane, right? So, you know, I do, like this worldview, and this is, you know, you referred to Dan Kahn's research and around worldview, where he talks about the dominance-based worldview being kind of, it's like climate change is kryptonite to this worldview. And what I'm saying is, it's not about convincing them that climate change is real, because they're being rational within their worldview. Like if you have this very hierarchical worldview which believes that, you know, men have a right to dominate women and nature and pretty much everybody else, and, you know, if you're wealthy, it's because you worked hard and deserve it. If you're poor, you deserve it too. Then you're going to have a huge problem with climate change, because that requires cooperation, it requires solidarity, it tells us that we live in interconnection. So a lot of the ways in which people metabolize that research that Dan does is, okay, well, we need to just come up with messaging that makes this not threatening to that worldview. And that's not the way I feel. I feel like that worldview is a threat to life on Earth, and we actually need to change it, you know? And that our problem is that that worldview has shifted the political pole massively to the right. And now the very sensible things that we need to do in the face of the climate crisis, like, you know, have a bold carbon tax and, you know, invest hugely in public transit, seem almost unthinkable. You know, I'm advocating that we actually move the pole, you know, as far as possible in the other direction. And what I think is significant about this Pope is that he isn't trying to appease that worldview. He's saying that we treat the world and one another like garbage, and that has to change. I mean, the phrase in the encyclical that I think is most important is throwaway culture. That the problem at the heart of the climate crisis is that we have a throwaway culture in which we treat the earth and one another like garbage, and that has to change. There isn't a way of reconciling that with what conservatism has become in the United States. You know, this is a culture where, you remember at presidential debates in the last electoral cycle, somebody said, what do you do if somebody is sick and they don't have health insurance and they show up in the emergency room and somebody screams out, let them die, and the whole room cheers, right? If you say that and cheer for that, and something in the culture is telling you that's okay, then you're also going to think it's okay that, you know, the Maldives are disappearing. You know, you'll have a story that rationalizes that. So we are talking about a shift in values and a shift in political culture, and whatever you label it, it's radical. It's radical from where we are right now.
No, that's a very good conclusion, and I mean, in very brief, I agree entirely with that diagnostic. Where we perhaps differ is more in the potential in working within the current system. So we come to exactly the same conclusion when it comes to the need for radical transformation to enable a safe future for humanity on planet Earth. What I'm hoping for increasingly is that we're starting to see so much evidence, which you also point out in the book, that we start seeing scalable, competitive, healthier, more democratic, much more community-savvy solutions which are not only delivering human well-being, but they're even able to save the planet, and that these technologies, from wind to water to biomass to different kinds of novel, innovative solutions for consumption and different kinds of material flows, could actually be, so to say, scaled and even amplified within the current societies, within a system where you could actually work with the market rather than say that capitalism is the fault of everything, which I tend to agree that it has escalated ourselves in the wrong direction. But could we perhaps break the logic and use what has been ruining us to actually escalate ourselves in the right direction? I mean, I find it, you know, before opening the floor to you, quite interesting that we start seeing big insurance companies, big holders of capital, big risk takers, you know, from insurance companies to pension holders, start putting the money in the divestment movement, which you yourself make a summary in, and they do that within the context of what you could call the kind of conventional capitalism. But if it goes to the right thing, it could actually escalate or amplify or accelerate changes in the right direction. I'm kind of curious in your Because your book, to be honest, of course I read it my glasses on, but I kind of tend to sense a little bit of a contradiction in parts. I mean, on the one hand, you're advocating for radicalism, for anti-capitalism, for bottom-up, extraordinary community engagement. And then on the other hand, you say that we're starting to see so many examples of innovation, transformation in the right direction, so we could actually, it seems, work with the system to some extent. And I'm kind of keen to...
Well, I say at the beginning of the book that I'm not making the argument that we need to overthrow capitalism before we can do anything about climate change. I mean, that would be a disaster. But what I actually believe is that, I feel like there's a danger of treating this as if it is just a technocratic problem. It's just about getting the right technologies and sort of making the right arguments to the right people, and then they'll realize that, look, the technology's there, let's just do it. And I think that what that doesn't confront is the role of vested interests and power and corruption and the need for really deep political and economic change. I don't think the reason we aren't acting on, the reason we aren't scaling up all of these great examples is not because we don't know how, and not because people haven't made the arguments persuasively enough. It's because of these huge vested interests that are fighting in the other direction. So partially what I'm doing is I think there's two pieces of the argument. One is just straight up numbers, where if we want to stay in our 2-degree carbon budget, and we want to do it in a way that is justice-based, which will bring China and India along. So it means we need to lead. That means we need to be cutting our emissions by 8 to 10% a year, according to the Tyndall Institute. I have yet to meet an economist who tells me how you can achieve that level of emission reduction within a context of an economic system that is built to pursue short-term growth. So yes, you can have emission reductions of 2%, 3%, maybe even 4%. I mean, Stern said 3, right? He's starting to say, okay, maybe 4, but 8 to 10, nobody on earth tells you how this is possible. So we're talking about a much more strategic economy where we grow the parts of our economy that are about getting off fossil fuels, and yes, there's a role for markets in that. But we do need to contract the parts of our economy that are just based on consumption and speculation. Because this problem we have, and in the book I quote Kevin Anderson, who I'm sure you know, at the Tyndall Center, the problem is when you have an economy that's built on fossil fuels, as you get off fossil fuels and invest in all of that good infrastructure, green infrastructure, you will get growth, but you will burn a lot of carbon in the process because you have economies built on fossil fuels. So there also has to be a strategy for contraction. Our current system isn't built to be strategic. And I think maybe from a Scandinavian perspective, it sounds easier to reconcile that, but from a North American perspective, it's so unthinkable to imagine how our current system could achieve that without very, very, very deep change. And I do hold up, Sweden and Denmark as examples, not perfect examples. And by the way, I think Vattenfall is probably the best counterexample to what I'm saying as a state-owned company that is involved. Second only to Statoil. So it's not, public is green, state-owned. We have terrible examples of state-owned companies in China and Saudi Arabia. But I would say that the chances of the Swedish people influencing Vattenfall are greater at this point, maybe, than the chances of Americans influencing Exxon. So I think use that power. Use the power of divestment. We need to use all of these tactics. But and I would just want to support my friends at 350 and say that it's time for Stockholm to divest and lead. And frankly, there's been incredible leadership in Sweden on divestment, and it's been very exciting to watch. But here's a separate issue. Okay, so if we accept that this is not just a technocratic problem, that there is also this problem of power and vested interests, and that the fossil fuel divestment movement is based on this very simple math that Bill McKibben encouraged us all to do that showed us chillingly that fossil fuel companies have 5 times more carbon in their proven reserves than is compatible with a 2-degree temperature target. And yet they spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year looking for more carbon, right? So that, if we win, they lose trillions of dollars, trillions of dollars. That carbon that we're saying can't be burned represents around $20 trillion, okay? So they fight, the forces, in charge of that, those pools of carbon, they fight hard and dirty and mean. They lie, they do whatever it takes. They buy politicians, they bribe. They bury climate research, as we're finding out. Exxon was doing research in the 1970s proving that climate change was happening, and yet they funded the climate change denial movement for decades, stalling, much needed action. So all of this is to say that faced with such powerful interests that really don't want us to win, we need to build a different kind of climate movement, a climate movement that will fight in a different way, that has a lot more on the line. And so when I say we need to change capitalism, it isn't only because of that 8 to 10%. I believe that to be true, but I also believe that strategically, we need to build a movement that recognizes the fact that this economic system is not only failing because of climate change, it is failing because of massive inequality, relentless austerity, and it is failing the vast majority of people on this planet. And they are mobilizing. They're mobilizing against austerity, they're mobilizing against police violence, they're mobilizing, demanding, a $15 minimum wage in the United States. If we can connect the dots between this movement and chart a justice-based transition off of fossil fuels that promises good jobs to the people who need it most. This is not something that will happen inevitably. This is something we have to fight for. Then we have a movement that is driven by the fact that climate action would deliver a better present than they have right now. And I believe that that's the only kind of movement that has a chance of winning against those trillions of dollars who have so much to lose, a movement which has a huge amount to gain. So that's a climate justice movement. That's not just like a nice, polite, NGO movement calling on governments to please take climate action. That's a movement that brings together a lot of communities that are getting a very, very bad deal under the current economic system. So to me, this is strategic. And I believe that sort of very polite, reasonable, technocratic approach to climate change is not sufficient in the face of those vested interests.
No, No, I very much respect this view, and overall, I think we're basically entirely together in the sense that the world needs to transform. Decarbonization has to occur, which we state clearly from science, within the next 35 years. We're talking of a zero fossil fuel world economy by 2050. We're in a situation where we're soon 10 billion co-citizens, everyone with a right to development. You cite very clearly the Greenhouse Development Rights work, which I chaired as a head of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which I think is the most advanced methodology, which shows very clearly that countries like Canada, like Sweden, actually, in staying within a global carbon budget, we have a responsibility to share the remaining carbon space with the poorest nations in the world by taking both historic responsibility and responsibility for our, let's say, purchasing power, economic power, which requires, as you rightly point out, a shift in mindset with relationship between us and planet Earth. So in all, I fully support that view, where I think potentially what makes me a bit nervous is your point about, which I also agree with, by the way, that we need a movement which is very active. Science points out very clearly that we need to regulate very clearly. We talk about a safe operating space, which you're also talking about in the book. But the question is, can a movement from below, from bottom up, occur fast enough to enable a mobilization of the world over the next 30, 35 years? That's where I'm in doubt. I'm wondering if it might be faster to decarbonize the world by showing that we can find advantages in doing so. And if we could regulate, I like you make so much point that we need to put very tough no signs, and these no signs are actually tough legal regulatory measures. But I'm less optimistic in your belief in the kind of in only having the kind of bottom-up movement. But I think we're talking about both.
It's not only, yeah. I mean, you look at Obama, in his first term, there wasn't this movement, this Blockadia movement taking on the pipelines and being in the streets and calling for divestment. It didn't exist. This is really just 4 years old since 350, and others launched the Keystone campaign and divestment just 3 years ago. In Obama's first term, he did basically nothing on climate. I mean, there was some good stuff in the stimulus bill, but he did nothing on passing any kind of comprehensive legislation. He was absolutely set to rubber stamp the Keystone XL pipeline. Yeah. And now we're seeing a different Obama, and I don't think it's because he suddenly saw the light. I think he understood climate change before, and he understands it now, but I think it's a gift to political leaders to have that kind of mobilized population.
So how important was the Harper-Trudeau shift in Canada?
Well, I think we are seeing. I mean, thinking about the good signs ahead of Paris. Among the others, that I mentioned, another couple good signs is that two of the world's worst climate criminals, aren't going to be at that party. Tony Abbott and Stephen Harper.
Which is good news.
It's good news. I mean, it's the beginning of our work. And in Canada, what we did is. We decided a coalition of more than 100 groups. We drafted what we call the LEAP Manifesto. It came out of a meeting of 60 movement leaders that the This Changes Everything team helped convene in May. It was about how we get to 100% renewables for the entire economy by mid-century, electricity significantly earlier than that. But how we do it in a way that systematically addresses gaping inequalities in our country. So that would mean that Indigenous people would be first in line to own and control their own renewable energy projects, for example. It would mean that we would reinvest in the caring economy in a huge way. So we would redefine what a green job is. A green job is not just putting up solar panels, though it's that. It's also taking care of kids and the elderly. And all of this low carbon work that is under constant siege under the logic of austerity and is not recognized as part of the low carbon economy, but is. And it would also mean opening our borders to far more refugees in recognition of the driver of climate change and wars that our governments have supported and trade deals that our governments have supported that are driving migration. So it became this galvanizing force. It was signed by tens of thousands of Canadians, and also by people like Leonard Cohen and Ellen Page and all of this. And it changed the debate pretty much. It had a big impact on the debate in the election. So I think it's not about saying policy doesn't matter. We're putting policies forward, very specific policies, and we're pushing politicians. And we see the impact in the United States, where the last presidential cycle, there were 3 presidential debates, and as you know, climate change was never mentioned, scandalously. And the Democratic debates so far between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, have been, oh no, I support 100% renewables more than you, and I'm against Keystone, no, I'm against Arctic drilling. So this is because of our movement, and when our movement is strong, we change politicians, we change policies, and we have to get stronger, and we'll change more. I think the best example, the best model is probably what happened after, in the midst of the Great Depression, in that interplay between very mobilized populations and politicians that were receptive to pressure, and that's what created the modern day social safety net. So to me, I think that just because I really, really value social movements does not mean that I'm saying we are going to win this one pipeline fight at a time. No, we're not. We are going to pivot from these campaign victories to policy victories. To me, the most important part of fossil fuel divestment, and the reason why I support it very strongly, is not because I think it's so important for universities to separate themselves from fossil fuel money. It's because every time a young person makes the argument that these are immoral profits, it brings us one step closer to being able to tax those profits, to get a much larger share of those profits to pay for this transition away from fossil fuels. If they're too illegitimate for our universities and cities to be invested in, then those profits are odious, and we have a right to those profits to pay for the mess that they represent.
No, clearly. This is absolutely clearly, and also to say that, I mean, you're in a country, and you referred to it, where there is actually a serious discussion at the government level of Sweden transforming and becoming the first fossil fuel-free welfare state in the world, which is a result of bottom-up movements, which has occurred over the last few years. So clearly, you're absolutely right. I think the point where I sense that we actually reach each other is actually that the bottom-up movement must, because of the speed of the transformation, also be responded with regulatory measures from above in order to have some top-down support, particularly for equity. I think that's absolutely critical. Now, just to prove that I'm kind of engaged in bottom-up as well, not only top-down, before opening the floor to you, as you may be aware, Science has put out something called the Earth Statement, which is a gathering from many of the top scientists that you refer to in the book, including people like Kevin Anderson and Jim Hansen and Nick Stern. And the key is we're running now a campaign from now till Paris to put a point of what science says is really necessary to accomplish, which is really aligned with your book, which is a transformation to a decarbonized future by 2050 under the limit of 2 degrees Celsius. And the key is to make a selfie with each other and put that out into the social media. So if you would be willing to have a selfie with me tonight on the stage, and hopefully you would do it the same, this would be a bottom-up effort of a transformation to the future. Would that be okay, Naomi?
Absolutely.
Before opening the floor. And the key is to write something nice on your hand. So I'd simply write the key statement from the Science, which is a graph.
You want to use my Sharpie?
I think this was okay. Good, and it goes down like this, and it's 100% renewable. And what would you put on your hand?
Would this work? My hand will be like that, or will we put our hands like together? This? Okay, like that? All right. All right.
Does that work?
Yeah.
And then I'll see if I find a camera here, and then we'll put this out.
But this means I have to write with my left hand.
Is that so? Perhaps I'll have to write for you then.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, because it'll be a mess.
A little peace sign?
All right, so what you do is you have to do it equals, 1, 2,
right. Okay.
Equal.
Okay, equals.
And then you have to do a circle.
A circle.
And then you have to make...
This is tough.
A peace sign. Oh, that's good.
Yeah?
All right. No, make the equals bigger.
Oh. You see, this is a real scientist I'm sitting next to who puts so much...
All right, this is our message for Paris.
Yes, let me see if I find a camera then. I've never made a selfie in my life.
Oh, this is gonna,
I'm a kind of dinosaur.
This is going to go badly.
Sorry. How do I do this? This is the way to... look at this. Look at this.
All right. Okay,
so here we are.
Okay, we're
wonderful.
Completely underexposed here.
1, 2, 3, go. I'll do it again. Yeah. Great.
We need a young person.
No, I did turn it around, I think. Yeah.
Young person.
So now, we'd love you to do the same. You put hashtag Earth Statement and put it out in social media. But floor is open.
Yes.
We have a few minutes for questions. And please say what your name is, if you feel like it, and pose a question. That would be wonderful. We have someone right here, and then coming right in the front. And don't forget to make that hashtag Earth Statement if you want to. We'll see if this worked. Yes, please.
If not, we'll do a retake.
My name is Anna Langset, and I'm from this network called the Klimatsverige. And I have 2 questions. The first one is, because there's loads of climate marches, November 29th, and it's here in Stockholm, but also around the world. And I wonder, my first question is, are you going, both of you? My second is, are you going to help us to get loads of people to go there?
Naomi.
So I am going to be in Paris on the 29th because the summit will just be starting. I was planning on going to the one in Paris, and I very much hope that I will still be going to the one in Paris. Right now, things are really up in the air. There are rumors about extending this state of siege, this state of emergency, that Hollande wants to extend it 3 months. And there are all kinds, I just came off a conference call with organizers, and it's very unclear what's going to be possible in Paris. But as you said, there are marches planned for hundreds of cities around the world. That was happening anyway. But what I would say to all of you is precisely because we don't know whether Parisians and people who are on the front lines of climate change, who are traveling from island nations, who are traveling from the Arctic, who are traveling to Paris so that their voices can be heard. We don't know whether their voices will be able to be heard on the 29th or even during the summit. There's all kinds of restrictions that may come down on civil society in Paris. And I think that really ups the ante, for all of you, that you really need to be out in the streets on the 29th on the eve of the climate summit to show your leaders, our leaders, that we want climate justice, not just climate action, but we want climate justice. Make it clear with your signs about what that means, and take it upon yourselves to speak even louder, precisely because people in Paris may not be able to speak as loudly as they should be able to because of what they're going through right now. It's an act of solidarity, and it's an act of peace.
No, this is so important, and the point about decarbonizing as an avenue for peace and to making the voices heard, because one thing is for sure, that our elected politicians, they do react on the pressure from below. That's absolutely clear, and they do that much, much more than we often believe, in fact. So any kind of real voices of change will be decisive. It's probably the most important point in the modern history of humanity on Earth.
And one thing I would just add is, when I was privileged to be in New York a little more than a year ago when there was the largest climate march in history. The People's Climate March. We knew it was going to be big. No one had any idea that it would be 400,000 people. And the most exciting part of that march was not that it was the biggest climate march ever, although it was. The biggest one previously was 100,000. It was that it looked and felt like New York City. It was so diverse. And you had, people from poor communities who were dealing with high asthma rates because all the toxic industries are in their neighborhoods. You had migrant rights activists making the link between climate change and migration. You had nurses making the link between climate change and health. It was so beautiful and so diverse. So I think what would be so powerful in this moment, if that march on the 29th really connected the dots with the anti-war movement, with the refugee rights movement, and really had a manifestation that was as diverse as this country is and is becoming more and more so.
And get the divestment movement out there as well. Absolutely. I had someone right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Peter Kalmström. I'm rather disappointed in both of you, actually, because you have not spoken out against animal agriculture. So my question is in 3 parts. Have you seen the movie Cowspiracy? It's a documentary. And the question is, do you deny the science in that movie? And do you deny the conclusion of that movie?
Yes, and yes. I think the science in Cowspiracy is way off base. I'm sorry, it is. Industrial agriculture is a huge driver of climate change, but the numbers and turning it all into an issue of animal agriculture is not correct. It has been refuted, and I don't think it is a conspiracy. I actually just think that people are focused on a range of subjects, and I keep hearing that it's a conspiracy. I don't think it is a conspiracy. I do think that we should all eat less meat. I think we will be healthier if we do so. I think it is part of a climate solution. I write about it in the book. But I think people are approaching this in a way that is unnecessarily conspiratorial.
Well done. Again, aligned with science. I would argue that this is absolutely the correct answer. I mean, it's a much more complex issue. Clearly, we need to transform also our diets away from the over-dependence on animal-based protein. But on the other hand, we're putting and loading too large kind of a victim role on the animal side. And remember one very important thing, that carbon dioxide from burning of coal, oil, and natural gas is releasing black carbon from the inner part of the planet that has been there for 100 million years. And once it's released, it's out there for over 1,000 years. What happens in the biosphere is something that transforms itself in periods of 10, 20, 30 years. It's a completely different cycle. Now, we as humans have influenced that clearly, so we need to reduce that impact. But one should be very clear that decarbonizing our fossil fuel dependence, as you point out in the book, is the #1 challenge. And that is the #1 task we have. It's absolutely critical.
And I would just thank you for that. I would just encourage people who are interested in this and interested in particular in shifting to agroecological farming methods as a real response to climate change to read Raj Patel's work, who is a leading thinker on this, and also Vandana Shiva's Soil Not Oil. I think they're fantastic resources.
So, dear Naomi, there's just one problem.
Okay.
And that is that time is running out for us. I could have sat here and talked with you the whole evening, I realize. But in fact, time is up right now. We're past our hour quite significantly, so we'll have to round off here. But I still want to give you a kind of a final opportunity to say, something about love. Because you write in such a wonderful way of your journey and that we need a new relationship between ourselves as humans and planet Earth. And in fact, believe it or not, it aligns itself very nicely with our science. So a few thoughts on the importance of love for this successful transition.
Wow, you're full of surprises. Well, I would love to. My favorite quote in the book actually comes from a goat rancher in Montana named Alexis Bonagovsky. And she's one of the greatest environmentalists I know. And she fights coal in the Powder River Basin with everything she has. She works very closely with indigenous people. And she says, and they're winning. Oh my God, they're winning on so many fronts. They've fought back pipelines and oil fracking and gas fracking and coal mines and coal trains and this incredible alliance they call it the Cowboys and Indians Alliance. And she says, what the coal companies will never understand is that it's not hatred that will save this place. Love will save this place. And that's what I've seen on the front lines of these struggles around the world. They're often pictured in the media, as these angry protests, and you just see, these confrontations with police. But they really, if you spend time with these amazing activists, it's really about groups of people falling in love more deeply with where they live, including in cities, and taking on that responsibility to protect their home place. And so, I believe that love is the very, very heart of this movement. And I'll just finish with the most beautiful thing that I've heard lately in this crazy life I've been living of meeting activists, who are fighting for our shared home around the world. I met this amazing young indigenous activist who is part of this fight against the world's largest coal mine in Australia, the Carmichael mine. It's a tough battle. They keep almost winning, and new strategies, and they're also protecting the Great Barrier Reef, one of the great wonders of the world, because that's where the coal would have to travel through to get to market. And I met this young activist. She's 20 years old. Her name is Marwa, and And I said, I can't believe what you're doing. You're only 20. And she said, well, it's great being 20. I love being 20. Because what we do matters so much. It matters so much for future generations, and that's something I've heard a lot, from people who are alive today, that they feel this weight of responsibility. But then she said something that I had never heard any young person say before. She said, and the other thing that's so great about being 20 is I get to live in this world that we're fighting for. And it's going to be so great. And she was basically saying, well, you're going to die, but we get to live in it. So that's what this is about. It's about love, and it's about Marwa and her friends. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Naomi Klein.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Johan. Excellent and inspiring. Yeah, let's have a standing ovation, please. Come on.
Thank you.
Should I do that selfie for you now, where you have the audience and the...
Oh yeah, we should redo our selfie.
Yeah, you should turn towards me, and I'll take it for you. So you
Can you do it for us? Here.
Thank you so much. Remember now what Naomi said, influence your politicians, learn them how to love, and everything will be fine in the end, hopefully.